So Pete Hegseth, this is the Secretary of Defense, is surprised, saying that actually, did you know the Iran war was over? So this is the story. Trump is pretty mad about the fact that he has to get congressional approval to continue military operations, right? The Congress has authorized the executive to say, listen, in the event of here's the story, in the event of a geopolitical crisis where you don't have time to bring an issue to Congress to have us deliberate, maybe it's during a recess, they say the president, you guys can push troops into a combat zone where you need to, for example, stabilize an ally, say one that's being invaded by its larger neighbor. We would never do that sort of thing, but one could imagine a future. Congress says, listen, you can get those troops in and you have 60 days to conduct those combat operations to sort of stabilize the situation. That's meant to buy you time for you to go to Congress and say, hey, declare war or authorize the use of troops or whatever term you want to use for it. Allow me to do these combat operations. And Pete Hegseth is actually saying, guess what, guys? We don't need to get approval because, you idiots, the war's over, right? Friday, that's today, is officially day 60 since Trump formally notified Congress of the strikes against Iran on March 2nd. Now, the actual strikes happened February 28th, but, reality has never really been that big a problem. And the U.S. law requires the president to terminate any use of U.S. armed forces within 60 days of such a notification unless Congress proactively allows a continuation. A senior administration official said hostilities with Iran had terminated, emphasizing that a ceasefire had been in effect since early April. Now, we're going to put a pin in that one, right? Now, the two sides haven't reached a longer-term deal, and the key shipping channel is effectively closed. And, there's just a tiny problem here, right? And that is a blockade an act of war? And you could see, we'll even add a naval blockade. Now, you might recall, those of you that are nerds, that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the reason the U.S. couldn't just blockade Cuba wholesale is because, it's a war under international law, which doesn't exist, but a naval blockade is considered an act of war, right? It's legally classified as an act of aggression, defined by the UN General Assembly, which explicitly lists the blockade of the ports or coasts of a state by the armed forces of another state as justification for the finding of aggression, right? This is, and I laugh at international law, but these definitions are important. And the reason is because the UN needs to be able to sit there and say, listen, who is the aggressor in a conflict? And by saying, listen, here are acts of aggression, these are the acts that are aggression, and these are the acts that are diplomacy. So again, for example, saying, listen, we refuse to import, we're banning imports from hostile country X. That is not an act of aggression, but blockading their ports is, right? These things matter, right? Now, there's the semantics. As we talk about, JFK used the term quarantine instead of blockade, right? The U.S. sought the goal of stopping Soviet ship movements without committing an act of war that would have legally enabled the Soviet military to respond. But I think the key difference here is that the quarantine under JFK may not have applied to civilian ships moving food or medicine, may have simply applied to vessels carrying nuclear material. And so that sort of it's a little fuzzy. But the key to take away is that by conducting a naval blockade of the strait, the U.S. is indeed conducting an act of war. And we watched videos of U.S. naval vessels firing on Iranian shipping vessels. So the existence of that video directly contradicts the secretary's statement. In fact, Congress, or the Department of Defense, which they call the Department of War, despite there being no legal basis to do so, released a video, right, firing on a Iranian vessel. see if we can actually find, we may be able to find the video here. Here we go. April 19th. U.S. forces disable a vessel attempting to enter Iranian port and violate the blockade. U.S. guided missile destroyer Spruance intercepted the Tuska as it transited the Arabian Sea. The crew failed to comply with repeated warnings over a 6-hour period. Spruance directed the vessel to evacuate its engine room and then disabled the propulsion system by firing rounds into the destroyer's engine room. Marines then boarded the vessel and took it into custody. So, there's video evidence, a press release by the Department of Defense, CENTCOM, on April 19th, clearly showing what appear to be continued combat operations. Not what appear to be. They're bragging about it. So again, the old Pete sounds really decisive, but it is not the case, right? And of course, Democrat Tim Kaine, Democrats always decisive, saying, I don't believe the statute would support that. I think the 60 days maybe runs maybe tomorrow, and then it's going to pose a really important legal question for the administration there. Wow, guys. Whew. Man, with opposition like that, the Trump administration barely needs friends. Just a couple of dictators here and there, and they'll have this complete, right? And again, the deeper problem, though, and there is a deeper problem, and one is the weakness of the Senate. The Senate keeps rejecting a war powers resolution, which is just stating the law clearly. They've tried 6 times, failing by essentially 3 votes, or really 2 votes. Susan Collins of Maine broke with Republicans for the first time, joining Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky to limit the war in Iran. To Rand Paul's credit, Rand Paul is a man with actual discernible values. He says, I believe this set of things, and I could give a fuck less about what other people believe, right? Like Ron Paul is like a stick in the river, right? Everybody else, the Republicans went from being small government civil liberties to now they're huge government, fuck civil liberties. But boy, you can always count on Rand Paul to at least have a real stance. Now, of course, guys, for saying things like you should get authorization for this, or doesn't Iran still have all their nuclear material, or why is Iran still able to block the Strait of Hormuz if their navy is 100% defeated? Pete Hegseth's truly phenomenal comeback, just really silencing the haters here by calling them reckless naysayers and defeatists from the cheap seats who have failed to recognize the many successes of the U.S. military against the Islamic Republic. Unfortunately, as we know from Iraq and Afghanistan, the generals love touting every success except for the ones that matter. Yeah, bombing a bunch of people is indeed success. Killing an 87-year-old dictator is indeed success. But were those the primary objectives? One, we went into this war with no discernible objectives other than make Israel happy with us. But then you also have the reality that the objectives that are announced, destroying the missile program, destroying the Navy, destroying the drones, destroying the nuclear program, none of those things have happened, right? And we can't believe this administration because remember, the nuclear program was destroyed according to this administration in June. So 6 months later, it's an imminent threat again. How could what happened? Did it like resurrect? Is it like a zombie? And if bombing it in June didn't work, why would bombing it today work? And the problem was once you're a liar, everything you say is taken as a lie. So should we believe them that the missile and drone programs were destroyed? Well, no, especially because Iran launched missile and drone programs, missiles and drones up until the day of the ceasefire. And their nuclear program, we're confident, has not been obliterated. It was simply the Iranians weren't pursuing a nuclear weapon. They simply wanted the enriched uranium to have a very small breakout capability. So, and of course their Navy, well, for a Navy that's been 100% sunk, something is blocking the Strait of Hormuz. They have some ability to do so. And so this is a clear situation where just the administration, I'm surprised that anyone even shows up to testimony. Testimony is such a stupid performance. It's a waste of time. Unless you're going to get these people to perjure themselves, which they may do, right? They may do. Again, you have to get them to like blatantly lie. But then you have to assume you're going to follow on with perjury charges. And here are some examples of the times that the administration has lied so far. On March 9th, in a phone interview with CBS, Trump said, quote, "I think the war is very complete pretty much," saying that Iran's military infrastructure had been decimated. Iran would continue after that statement to launch something in the order of hundreds of drones and dozens of ballistic missiles, including at U.S. bases. 2 days later, he declared in Kentucky, quote, "We won," though he later clarified that some operations were, quote, "still moving along very rapidly." On April 7th, while announcing a 2-week ceasefire, Trump declared, quote, "total and complete victory," and stated that the U.S. had, quote, "exceeded all military objectives," which they basically reinterpreted them so that you couldn't fail, right? Like even if, so you notice that destroy the missile and drone program became degrade the missile and drone program. And that's a really important distinction because degrade something just means to make it less capable than it was at the start. And so technically, by allowing US bases to get hit by Iranian missiles, that itself degrades the Iranian missile program because every missile that hits an American base is technically a missile Iran no longer has. And so by using degrade as the metric, it's actually, you can't lose. Like, it's always degraded. Again, in the short term, right? In the very long term, though, this war isn't going on for the very long term. Right? The April 21st ceasefire. And then, of course, on May 1st, today, a formal letter to Congress, Trump claimed that hostilities had been terminated. Tough to say if that is true, right? They terminated with the ceasefire. As we have discussed, that is simply not the case. Let's wrap up talking about that. Okay, sorry, I saw some super chats. Oh, I see it. Seven Dust. International law does exist when each signatory ratifies it domestically. Geneva Conventions are hard law. So I'm going to split hairs with you a little bit on this one. International law, you are correct. Nothing in your statement is incorrect. I want to be clear about that. But when international law becomes domestic law, then it's just domestic law. Do you see what I mean? Like, yeah, definitely. When Pete Hegseth tells the orders the United States military, give them no quarter, that is a Geneva Convention violation. And the U.S. I think it's called the War Crimes Act. The existence of the War Crimes Act means that he has violated U.S. domestic law in addition to violated the Geneva Conventions. But again, as we see with, say, Vladimir Putin, right? He has violated international law and violated Russian law. It is illegal to commit a war crime under Russian law. But Vladimir Putin and other Russian soldiers will not face consequences because the only enforcement mechanism for that is domestic law, right? So if Russian domestic law doesn't pursue it, then it's not a crime, which I think fairly clearly indicates that other than a tiny number of exceptions of essentially ousted war criminals, butchers in African civil wars and such, you really don't see Geneva Conventions enforced, in Geneva, so to speak. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, check out another video here, and of course, become a member at combatvetnews.com for access to an entire archive of premium videos, including combat footage that YouTube would never let me show you. The link is in the description. And of course, a huge thanks to all of the Combat Vet News members.